The radio crackled with static as voices overlapped, sharp with urgency. The carrier deck pitched violently in the storm, waves crashing over the bow as 60-knot winds howled across the steel. 3 aircraft had already diverted to land bases. The mission was in jeopardy. She stood at the edge of the ready room, silent in her flight suit, unseen by most. The weather data in her hand showed what the others missed: a brief window in the storm, a moment of possibility. Without waiting for permission, she stepped forward, pointed once at the tactical display, and spoke quietly. The room fell silent. The decision was made. No one cheered, no one clapped, but they all watched as she walked toward the flight deck. She had seen what mattered most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. USS Constellation cut through the Pacific, swells like a blade through dark water, her massive hull riding the rhythm of waves that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The nuclear-powered supercarrier displaced nearly 100,000 tons, yet she moved with surprising grace across the ocean's surface, her 4 bronze propellers churning white foam in her wake. Steam rose from her catapults in the cool morning air, dissipating quickly in the salt-laden breeze that swept across her flight deck. At 1,092 feet long and 252 feet wide, the Constellation was a floating city of steel and purpose. Her flight deck, coated in non-skid material that provided grip for both aircraft tires and boot soles, stretched out like a vast gray runway marked with painted lines, numbers, and directional arrows. The island's superstructure rose from the starboard side, bristling with radar arrays, communication equipment, and the primary flight control tower that overlooked the organized chaos below. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of jet fuel, hot metal, and ocean spray, a combination that every sailor aboard knew by heart. The deck crew moved with practiced precision, their colored jerseys identifying their roles: yellow for aircraft directors, blue for aircraft handlers, red for ordnance specialists, green for maintenance personnel, and brown for plane captains. Each person knew their place in the intricate choreography that kept naval aviation operating at the razor's edge of efficiency. Aircraft dotted the deck in carefully organized rows. F-A-18 Super Hornets sat with their wings folded upward, their twin tails reaching toward the sky like steel fins. Their gray paint schemes bore the markings of various squadrons: the Jolly Rogers with their distinctive skull and crossbones, the Golden Warriors with their eagle emblem, and the Diamondbacks with their geometric snake design. Each aircraft represented millions of dollars of advanced technology, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 1.8, and carrying an array of sophisticated weapon systems. The catapults stretched across the forward portion of the flight deck, their tracks embedded in the steel like railroad rails. Steam hissed from their mechanisms as the crew prepared for the morning's launch operations. The massive machinery could accelerate a 30-ton aircraft from 0 to 165 miles per hour in just 2.5 seconds, generating forces that would pin a pilot back in their seat with crushing intensity. In the ready rooms below deck, pilots gathered around briefing tables, their flight suits bearing name tags, squadron patches, and the various insignia that marked their experience and specializations. The rooms hummed with the low conversation of men and women who had dedicated their lives to one of the most demanding professions in the world. Charts covered the walls, showing weather patterns, navigation routes, and tactical considerations. The air was thick with the tension that always preceded flight operations, a mixture of excitement, professionalism, and the underlying awareness that every launch carried inherent risks. The ship's complement included over 5,000 personnel, from the commanding officer down to the newest seaman recruit. Each person aboard contributed to the mission of projecting American naval power across the world's oceans. The constellation served as both a symbol of technological achievement and a reminder of the dedication required to maintain such a complex operation far from home. Among the crew, hierarchies were clearly defined, but respect was earned through competence and reliability. The aviators occupied a special place in this ecosystem. They were the tip of the spear, the ones who would carry the fight to the enemy when called upon. Their training was extensive, their skills honed through countless hours of practice, and their confidence born from successfully handling aircraft worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The flight simulator complex occupied several compartments deep within the ship's hull, away from the noise and movement of the flight deck. Here, in climate-controlled spaces filled with sophisticated computer equipment, pilots could practice their skills without the risks associated with actual flight. The simulators were marvels of modern technology, capable of reproducing the exact feel of flying an A-18 in virtually any conditions imaginable. Motion platforms moved the cockpit replicas through realistic flight profiles, while high-definition screens provided visual environments so detailed they were often indistinguishable from reality. Yet for all their sophistication, the simulators carried a subtle stigma among some of the more traditional aviators. They were seen as training tools, certainly, but not as substitutes for the real thing. The attitude was reflected in casual conversations, in the way pilots discussed their training records, and in the informal hierarchies that developed within squadrons. Real flight hours mattered more than simulator time, and everyone knew it. The morning briefing had covered weather conditions, mission parameters, and safety considerations. The Pacific was showing signs of deteriorating conditions to the west, with a storm system building that could affect operations within the next 48 hours. For now, though, the seas were manageable, the winds were within acceptable limits, and the schedule called for a full day of training flights and tactical exercises. As the ship's crew prepared for another day of operations, the complexity of their mission became apparent in every detail. From the precise timing required to launch aircraft safely, to the intricate coordination needed to recover them aboard a moving platform, carrier operations represented one of the most challenging endeavors in modern military aviation. Success depended not just on individual skill, but on the seamless integration of hundreds of people working toward a common goal. The Constellation continued her passage through the Pacific, her wake spreading white behind her as she maintained course and speed. Above, the sky stretched clear and blue, offering perfect visibility for the training exercises planned for the day. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the flight deck and the men and women who would soon launch into the vast expanse of ocean and sky that surrounded them. In this environment of precision, tradition, and technological sophistication, every crew member had their role to play. Some roles were more visible than others, some received more recognition, and some carried more prestige. But each was essential to the success of the mission, whether that success was measured in training objectives met, tactical problems solved, or the simple but crucial task of bringing every aircraft and every pilot home safely at the end of each day. The steel ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a reminder of both the vastness of the world and the small floating island of American naval power that moved purposefully through its midst. Here, far from land, the crew of the Constellation prepared to demonstrate once again why carrier aviation remained one of the most potent expressions of military capability in the modern world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the maze of corridors beneath the flight deck, where the constant hum of machinery mixed with the muffled sounds of boots on steel grating, Lieutenant Junior Grade Julia Bond made her way through the ship's narrow passageways. Her flight suit bore the standard issue patch's name tag, wings, and squadron insignia, but lacked the additional decorations that marked the more seasoned aviators. The fabric was newer than most, still holding its original color without the fading that came from countless hours under the sun and salt spray of carrier operations. Julia carried a tablet computer in one hand, its screen displaying flight data and training schedules that she reviewed as she walked. Her steps were measured and purposeful, navigating the ship's layout with the confidence of someone who had spent months learning every shortcut and alternate route. She passed through sections where pipes and cables ran overhead, where the ship's vital systems hummed behind panels, marked with technical specifications and warning labels. The junior officers' quarters were located several decks below the flight deck, in a section where the ship's movement was more pronounced. Here, the gentle rolling motion of the carrier could be felt as a subtle shift in balance, a reminder that despite the ship's massive size, they were still subject to the rhythm of the ocean. Julia's stateroom was compact but efficiently designed, with a fold-down desk, a narrow bunk, and storage compartments that maximized the use of every available inch. Her personal effects were minimal and carefully organized. A few photographs sat on the small shelf above her desk, family images from her hometown in Ohio, showing a modest house with a well-maintained lawn and the kind of tree-lined street that defines suburban America. Her parents appeared in one photo, both wearing expressions of quiet pride at her commissioning ceremony. Her father's eyes held the particular look of someone who had served himself, understanding both the honor and the burden of military service. The aviation training records stored in her personal files told a story of steady, unremarkable progress. Julia had completed her primary flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where she had flown the T-6 Texan II trainer aircraft. Her grades were consistently above average but never exceptional, earning her the respect of her instructors. Without drawing particular attention, she had shown aptitude for navigation, instrument flying, and the complex procedures required for carrier operations, but her performance fell into the category that flight instructors classified as solid, rather than outstanding. Advanced training had taken her to Naval Air Station Kingsville in Texas, where she had transitioned to the T-45 Goshawk, the Navy's advanced jet trainer. The aircraft was specifically designed to prepare pilots for the challenges of carrier aviation, with a tailhook for arrested landings and the structural strength to handle the stresses of catapult launches. Julia had adapted well to the increased complexity and performance of the jet aircraft, but again, her instructors noted her as competent rather than exceptional. The transition to the F-A-18 Super Hornet had been the culmination of her training pipeline. The aircraft was a marvel of modern aviation technology, capable of both air-to-air combat and precision ground attack missions. Its twin engines could generate over 44,000 pounds of thrust, pushing the aircraft to speeds exceeding Mach 1.8 while carrying a sophisticated array of sensors, weapons, and countermeasures. For Julia, earning her wings and the designation of naval aviator had represented the achievement of a childhood dream that had begun with airshow visits and plastic model airplanes. Her assignment to the Constellation had come through the standard personnel system, matching her qualifications with the needs of the fleet. She had reported aboard 3 months earlier, during the ship's workup period. Before deployment, the process of integrating into the squadron had been methodical, learning the ship's procedures, understanding the specific protocols of her new unit, and beginning the complex process of becoming proficient in all aspects of carrier operations. The ready room, where Julia spent much of her time, was a functional space designed for briefings, planning, and the informal interactions that built squadron cohesion. Rows of chairs faced a large screen used for presentations, while smaller tables provided workspace for flight planning and administrative tasks. The walls displayed the squadron's history, including photographs of previous deployments, aircraft configurations, and the names of pilots who had distinguished themselves in combat or training. Her fellow aviators were a diverse group representing various backgrounds and levels of experience. Some were veterans of multiple deployments who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from proven performance under pressure. Others were newer to the fleet, like Julia, working to establish themselves within the squadron's informal hierarchy. The social dynamics were complex, influenced by factors ranging from flight performance to personality, to the simple chemistry that determined whether individuals meshed well together. The squadron's commanding officer, Commander Rebecca Hayes, was a seasoned aviator with over 2,000 flight hours and 2 combat deployments to her credit. Her leadership style balanced professional standards with an understanding of the human elements that made squadrons successful. She had earned the respect of her pilots through competence and fairness, but she also maintained the clear lines of authority necessary for military aviation operations. Julia's initial months aboard the Constellation had been focused on completing her carrier qualification requirements. The process involved numerous practice approaches, touch-and-go landings, and the careful progression of skills that would eventually lead to independent operations. She had performed adequately in all phases of training, meeting the standards required for qualification while not exceeding them by significant margins. The simulator training had been a particular area where Julia had shown consistent performance. The sophisticated computer systems could replicate virtually any flying condition, from clear weather approaches to emergency procedures in degraded visibility. Her scores were always within acceptable parameters, demonstrating the technical proficiency required for safe operations. However, her performance lacked the exceptional elements that would have distinguished her from her peers. Her approach to training was methodical and thorough. She studied procedures manuals during her off-duty hours, reviewing the complex checklists and emergency procedures that governed every aspect of naval aviation. Her notebook was filled with detailed notes, diagrams, and the kind of careful documentation that reflected a disciplined approach to learning. She asked questions when appropriate, sought clarification when procedures were unclear, and maintained the professional demeanor expected of a naval officer. The informal conversations that took place in the ready room and the ship's wardroom revealed the subtle attitudes that existed within the aviation community. There was respect for competence, but also an appreciation for the exceptional performers who pushed beyond minimum standards. Stories were shared about legendary pilots who had achieved remarkable feats, and these tales reinforced the cultural values that define naval aviation excellence. Julia listened to these conversations with interest, understanding that they represented both the heritage of her profession and the expectations that would shape her career. She was aware that her own performance, while satisfactory, had not yet earned her a place among the squadron's standout performers. This awareness was neither discouraging nor motivating in any dramatic sense. It was simply a realistic assessment of her current standing within the group. Asterisk. The ship's daily routine provided structure and predictability to life aboard the Constellation. Flight operations followed carefully choreographed schedules that maximized training opportunities while maintaining safety standards. Julia participated in these operations according to her qualification level, gradually taking on more responsibility as her experience grew. Her quarters provided a quiet space for reflection and study during the hours when flight operations were secured. The ship never truly slept, but the intensity of activity varied with the operational schedule. During these quieter periods, Julia could be found reviewing flight procedures, writing emails to family, or simply sitting quietly with her thoughts as the ship continued its passage through the Pacific. The vastness of the ocean surrounding the Constellation served as a constant reminder of the environment in which they operated. Hundreds of miles from the nearest land, the ship represented a small island of American presence in an enormous expanse of water. This isolation created both challenges and opportunities, requiring self-sufficiency while providing the freedom to conduct training operations without the constraints of land-based airspace. Julia had adapted well to this environment, finding purpose in the daily routines and satisfaction in the steady improvement of her skills. Her future remained unwritten, shaped by the performance that was yet to come and the opportunities that would arise during the deployment ahead. The meteorology office aboard the USS Constellation occupied a compartment 3 decks below the Faux flight deck, surrounded by banks of computer servers and displays that processed weather data from satellites, ships, and aircraft scattered across the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, the ship's senior meteorologist, stood before a wall of monitors showing atmospheric conditions stretching from the California coast to the Marshall Islands. The images revealed a story that was becoming increasingly concerning. A massive low-pressure system had begun organizing itself roughly 800 nautical miles to the west, its spiral bands of clouds clearly visible on the satellite imagery. The storm was still in its early stages, but the computer models were unanimous in their projections. It was strengthening rapidly and moving eastward at a pace that would bring it into the carrier's operating area within 48 hours. The meteorological data showed wind speeds already exceeding 50 knots in the storm's outer bands, with gusts potentially reaching 70 knots as the system continued to intensify. Commander Chun had spent the morning reviewing the latest forecasts with her team, comparing different modeling systems and analyzing the subtle variations that could mean the difference between manageable conditions and a serious threat to flight operations. The storm's projected path showed it passing directly through the carrier's assigned patrol area, and the timing couldn't have been worse. A critical training exercise was scheduled for the following day, involving coordination with allied forces and the testing of new tactical procedures that had been months in development. The bridge of the Constellation hummed with activity as the officer of the deck coordinated the ship's movements with the Tactical Operations Center. Captain Thomas Mitchell, the ship's commanding officer, reviewed the weather reports with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades at sea. His weathered hands held the meteorological summary, while his eyes moved between the printed data and the horizon visible through the bridge windows. The ocean around the carrier had begun to show the first signs of the approaching disturbance. Swells that had been running in a predictable pattern for days were now showing subtle changes in direction and amplitude. The barometric pressure readings had started a gradual decline, and the wind patterns were shifting from the stable trade winds that had dominated the region to the more variable conditions that preceded major weather systems in the ship's combat. Information Center radar operators monitored the electronic displays that tracked aircraft, surface vessels, and weather patterns across hundreds of miles of ocean. The storm system appeared on their screens as a massive, slowly rotating mass of precipitation and wind that dwarfed even the largest aircraft formations. The meteorological radar showed the storm's internal structure, revealing the eye wall and spiral bands that marked it as a mature tropical cyclone. Flight operations for the day proceeded normally, but with an increased emphasis on monitoring conditions and ensuring that all aircraft could be recovered safely before weather conditions deteriorated. The air traffic control team coordinated launches and recoveries with particular attention to wind patterns and visibility, knowing that the margin for error would decrease significantly once the storm's outer bands reached the carrier's position. Intelligence briefing room adjacent to the ship's command center had been converted into a weather planning center, where meteorologists worked alongside operations planners to develop contingency plans for the approaching storm. Large charts covered the walls, showing the storm's projected path overlaid with the carrier's operational requirements and the positions of other naval units in the region. The storm was following a track that would take it through several critical shipping lanes, potentially affecting commercial traffic and complicating the logistics of naval operations. Weather routing specialists worked to identify alternative courses that might allow the Constellation to avoid the worst conditions while still maintaining her assigned patrol responsibilities. The ship's engineering department had begun preparations. For heavy weather operations, securing equipment, and conducting inspections of critical systems that would be stressed by the violent motion of the ship in rough seas. The massive aircraft elevators were tested and secured, while the flight deck crew began the process of chaining down aircraft and equipment that could be damaged by high winds and heavy seas. In the hangar bay, maintenance crews worked with increased urgency to complete scheduled repairs and inspections. The enclosed space, normally bustling with activity, had taken on an atmosphere of focused intensity as technicians ensured that every aircraft would be mission-ready once the storm passed. The familiar sounds of power tools and equipment testing echoed off the hangar's steel walls, punctuated by the communications between work crews and supervisors. The crew's mess halls buzzed with conversations about the approaching weather, as sailors shared stories of previous storms and speculated about the likely impact on their operations. Veterans of multiple deployments spoke with the authority of experience, describing the motion of the ship in heavy seas and the challenges of maintaining routine operations when the deck pitched and rolled with the massive swells. The ship's medical department had begun its own preparations, ensuring that medical supplies were properly secured and that treatment facilities were ready for the increased number of injuries that typically accompanied rough weather operations. The senior medical officer reviewed procedures for treating seasickness, which could affect even experienced sailors during severe storms. Communication with fleet headquarters had intensified, with regular updates on the storm's progress and the carrier's planned response. The satellite communication systems that linked the Constellation to command centers thousands of miles away carried a steady stream of meteorological data, operational updates, and planning information. The storm's impact extended beyond the immediate weather considerations. The training exercise scheduled for the following day involved coordination with aircraft from 3 different nations, representing months of diplomatic and operational planning. The possibility of canceling or postponing the exercise carried significant political and military implications, requiring careful consideration of alternatives and contingency plans. Allied ships operating in the region had begun adjusting their positions in response to the weather forecasts, creating a complex coordination challenge for naval operations planners. The storm's path would affect not only the Constellation, but also the destroyer escorts, supply ships, and allied vessels that formed the broader naval formation. The submarine force operating in the region faced different challenges, as the storm's effects would be minimal below the surface but could complicate coordination with surface units and affect their ability to communicate with higher headquarters. The intricate timing of naval operations required constant adjustment as weather conditions changed. As evening approached, the first clouds associated with the storm's outer bands became visible on the horizon. The sunset, normally a spectacular display of color reflecting off the ocean surface, was muted by the high, thin clouds that stretched across the western sky. The sea state began to increase noticeably, with swells running higher and the wind picking up from the southwest. The Constellation maintained her course and speed, but preparations for the approaching storm continued throughout the ship. Weather deck equipment was secured, and the crew prepared for the possibility of heavy weather operations that could last for days. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was a reality that would test the ship, her crew, and their ability to maintain operations under the most challenging conditions the ocean could provide. The latest weather update showed the storm continuing to intensify, with maximum sustained winds now exceeding 60 knots and the potential for further strengthening as it moved across the warm waters of the Pacific. The eye of the storm was clearly defined on satellite imagery, surrounded by the tight spiral bands that marked a mature and dangerous weather system. As the ship prepared for the challenges ahead, the crew understood that the next 48 hours would test their training, their equipment, and their ability to operate effectively in conditions that would push both human and machine to their limits. The storm was coming, and there was no avoiding the confrontation between the power of nature and the determination of the men and women who served aboard the Constellation. The flight simulator complex buzzed with activity as the morning training session reached its peak intensity. Banks of computer screens displayed flight data while the mechanical whir of motion platforms filled the air as pilots practiced approaches in increasingly challenging conditions. The storm simulation program had been loaded across all 6 simulator bays, creating virtual weather conditions that matched the meteorological projections for the real storm system approaching the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood at the central monitoring station, his flight suit bearing the patches of someone who had accumulated over 1,500 hours of actual flight time across 2 deployments. His call sign, Thunderbolt, was embroidered below his name tag, a nickname earned during his first combat cruise when he had successfully completed a night strike mission, despite equipment failures that would have forced most pilots to abort. Morrison commanded respect within the squadron, not just for his experience, but for his ability to perform under pressure when it mattered most. The simulator bay assignments had been posted on the squadron's daily schedule, and Morrison had taken particular interest in the performance metrics being generated by each pilot's session. The computer systems tracked every aspect of simulated flight performance, from approach angles and airspeed control to the precise timing of landing procedures. These metrics were compiled into scores that, while not officially part of fitness reports, carried significant weight in the informal evaluations that shaped squadron dynamics. Julia Bond occupied Simulator Bay 4. Her session focused on carrier approaches in deteriorating weather conditions. The computer-generated environment showed a pitching deck, reduced visibility, and wind conditions that pushed the boundaries of safe landing parameters. Through the observation window, Morrison could see her methodical approach to each simulated landing, her movements precise but lacking the aggressive confidence that marked the squadron's top performers. "Check out Bond's approach speed," Morrison called to Lieutenant Ryan Maverick Sullivan, who was reviewing training schedules at a nearby workstation. Sullivan looked up from his paperwork, his attention drawn to the display showing Julia's current simulation parameters. The data showed her maintaining slightly higher than optimal approach speeds, a common technique among newer pilots who prioritize safety margins over performance optimization. The simulation data revealed a consistent pattern in Julia's performance. Her approaches were stable and controlled, meeting all safety requirements while avoiding the aggressive techniques that could shave precious seconds off landing times. In combat situations, those seconds could mean the difference between successful mission completion and having to divert to alternate airfields. But in training, the conservative approach was often viewed as a sign of limited capability. Morrison pulled up Julia's historical training records on his tablet, scrolling through months of simulation data that painted a picture of steady, unremarkable performance. Her scores consistently fell within the acceptable range, demonstrating competence without excellence. The pattern was so consistent that it had become predictable, and predictability in naval aviation was often interpreted as a ceiling rather than a foundation. "She's been flying the same profile for 3 months, Morrison observed, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had identified a problem. No improvement, no variation, just the same safe approach every time. That's not going to cut it when we're dealing with real weather conditions." The conversation drew the attention of several other pilots who were between simulation sessions. Lieutenant Commander David Shark Patterson, the squadron's operations officer, leaned over to examine the display showing Julia's current approach parameters. Patterson's reputation was built on his ability to land aboard the carrier in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots, and his opinions on pilot performance carried significant weight within the squadron. "Look at this approach angle," Patterson said, pointing to the flight path display. "She's coming in high and slow, burning off altitude instead of maintaining a proper glide slope." That technique might work in the simulator, but it's going to be a problem in actual carrier landings, especially with a pitching deck. The criticism was technically accurate. Julia's approach profile showed a tendency to maintain extra altitude until the final moments of the approach, then use a steeper descent angle to reach the landing area. The technique provided additional safety margins, but required more precise timing and could become problematic if wind conditions changed rapidly during the approach phase. Other pilots began gathering around the monitoring station, drawn by the discussion of simulator performance and the opportunity to analyze a fellow aviator's techniques. The informal gathering quickly took on the atmosphere of a teaching session, with experienced pilots sharing their perspectives on optimal approach procedures and the challenges of carrier landings. The problem with simulator training offered Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez, a pilot with extensive experience in both simulators and actual aircraft, is that it's too forgiving. You can get away with techniques that would be dangerous in real flying because the computer doesn't replicate all the variables you encounter in actual operations. The discussion revealed the complex relationship between simulator training and actual flight operations. While the computer systems were sophisticated and provided valuable training opportunities, they operated within programmed parameters that, despite their complexity, could not fully replicate the unpredictable nature of real-world flying. This limitation was well understood by experienced pilots who viewed simulator performance as useful but not definitive in evaluating pilot capability. Morrison accessed the squadron's training database, pulling up comparative performance data. That showed how Julia's scores ranked against other pilots in similar experience categories. The numbers confirmed what the informal observations had suggested. Her performance was consistently average, neither exceptional nor concerning, but firmly planted in the middle range of squadron capabilities. "Here's what I don't understand," Morrison said, addressing the group of pilots who had gathered around the monitoring station. "She's been flying the same conservative profile for months, but she's not pushing herself to improve. Every other pilot in the squadron has shown progression in their simulator scores, but Bond's numbers are flat." The comments sparked a broader discussion about training philosophy and the expectations placed on squadron members. Some pilots argued that consistent performance was valuable, and that not everyone needed to be a top performer. Others contended that naval aviation demanded continuous improvement, and that pilots who plateaued early in their careers were unlikely to handle the challenges of combat operations. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Viper Rodriguez, who served as one of the squadron's instructor pilots, offered a different perspective. "Sometimes the pilots who look unremarkable in training are the ones who perform best under actual pressure. The simulator creates artificial stress, but it's not the same as making decisions when your life depends on getting it right." The debate continued as Julia's simulation session progressed. Her performance remained consistent with her historical pattern, competent approaches that met minimum standards without demonstrating exceptional skill or aggressive techniques. The real-time data showed her maintaining steady control inputs, making small corrections as needed, and following proper procedures throughout each approach sequence. As the session neared its conclusion, Morrison made a decision that would have significant consequences. He activated the scenario modification system, changing the simulated weather conditions to match the most extreme projections for the actual storm system approaching the carrier. The modification introduced severe turbulence, reduced visibility, and wind shear conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots. Let's see how she handles the real deal," Morrison announced, his voice carrying a mixture of professional interest and skeptical challenge. The enhanced simulation parameters appeared on the monitoring displays, showing conditions that exceeded the standard training scenarios by significant margins. Julia's simulator bay suddenly became more active as the motion platform responded to the new environmental parameters. The simulated cockpit pitched and rolled as virtual wind gusts struck the aircraft, and the visual display showed a carrier deck that appeared to be moving violently through heavy seas. The landing signal officer's voice crackled through the simulation speakers, calling out conditions that would test the limits of safe carrier operations. The pilots gathered around the monitoring station watched with increased interest as Julia began her approach in the enhanced conditions. Her technique remained consistent with her previous approaches, but the environmental challenges were now significantly greater. The data displays showed her aircraft being buffeted by simulated wind shear, requiring constant corrections to maintain proper approach parameters. "This should be interesting," Patterson commented. His eyes focused on the flight path display that showed Julia's aircraft struggling to maintain stability in the turbulent conditions. "These are the kind of conditions that separate the good pilots from the great ones." The simulation continued as Julia worked to bring her virtual aircraft aboard the carrier in conditions that pushed beyond normal training parameters. Her performance would be evaluated not just on technical metrics, but on her ability to adapt to challenging circumstances and make the kind of split-second decisions that define successful naval aviators. The stage was set for a demonstration that would reveal whether Julia's consistent but unremarkable performance reflected actual limitations, or simply a conservative approach that concealed greater capabilities. The enhanced simulation would provide the first real test of her ability to handle the extreme conditions that the approaching storm would bring to actual flight operations. The atmosphere in the simulator complex had shifted from routine training to something resembling a trial. Word had spread through the squadron about Morrison's decision to test Julia with extreme weather conditions, and pilots who had been attending to other duties found reasons to visit the simulator bay. The observation windows that normally provided privacy for training sessions were now crowded with faces, creating an audience for what had become an impromptu demonstration of pilot capability. Julia's simulator bay vibrated with the mechanical force of the motion platform as it replicated the violent movement of an aircraft approaching the carrier in 60-knot winds. The visual displays showed a storm-lashed ocean with waves breaking over the carrier's bow, while the flight deck pitched through angles that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The simulated cockpit instruments flickered with warnings and cautions as the computer system generated the kind of emergency conditions that tested the limits of both human and machine performance. The enhanced simulation parameters had been drawn from actual meteorological data, representing conditions that had been encountered during previous storms, but rarely replicated in training scenarios. Wind shear patterns changed unpredictably, creating sudden updrafts and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft toward the deck or lift it dangerously high above the optimal approach path. The carrier's movement through heavy seas added another layer of complexity as the landing area moved through 3 dimensions in patterns that defied prediction. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood at the central monitoring station, his arms crossed as he watched the real-time data streaming from Julia's simulation. The flight parameters showed her aircraft being buffeted by forces that exceeded normal training scenarios by significant margins. Her airspeed fluctuated as she fought to maintain control, and her approach angle varied as the simulated wind conditions pushed her aircraft off the ideal glide slope. "Look at those control inputs," Morrison called to the gathered pilots, pointing to the display showing Julia's stick and rudder movements. "She's fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. In conditions like these, you need to be smooth, predictive, not reactive." The criticism was harsh but technically accurate. The data showed Julia making rapid corrections to counter the simulated wind effects, her control inputs appearing as erratic spikes on the monitoring displays. The technique was understandable given the challenging conditions, but it demonstrated a reactive approach rather than the anticipatory flying that marked exceptional pilots. Lieutenant Commander Patterson moved closer to the monitoring station. his eyes scanning the multiple displays that showed different aspects of Julia's performance. "Her approach speed is all over the place," he observed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made countless carrier landings in actual adverse conditions. "You can't maintain a stable approach when you're constantly chasing airspeed." The comment drew nods from several of the watching pilots, who recognized the fundamental challenge of carrier aviation. Maintaining precise control of multiple flight parameters simultaneously required a level of skill that could only be developed through extensive experience and natural aptitude. The simulator was revealing whether Julia possessed the inherent capabilities that could be developed into exceptional performance. Inside the simulator bay, Julia gripped the flight controls with hands that had begun to perspire despite the climate-controlled environment. The artificial horizon on her instrument panel showed the dramatic attitude changes as her simulated aircraft fought through the turbulent conditions. The landing signal officer's voice crackled through the headset, providing guidance that was barely audible over the simulated wind noise and engine sounds. "Call the ball," came the LSO's voice, requesting that Julia visually acquire the optical landing system that would guide her final approach to the carrier deck. The visual display showed the Fresnel lens system, its lights barely visible through the simulated spray and rain that obscured the flight deck. The ball appeared as a dim amber light that seemed to dance in the turbulent air, providing the visual reference that would determine whether her approach was on target. Julia's training had prepared her for this moment, but the extreme conditions pushed beyond the normal parameters of simulator instruction. The aircraft's response to her control inputs was delayed and unpredictable, as the computer system replicated the effects of severe turbulence on flight characteristics. Every correction she made seemed to generate new problems, creating a cascade of challenges that tested her ability to prioritize and manage multiple threats simultaneously. The watching pilots observed her performance with the critical eye of professionals who understood the subtleties of carrier aviation. Some recognized the difficulty of the conditions she was facing, while others focused on the technical deficiencies that were becoming apparent under pressure. The simulation had become a real-time evaluation of pilot capability with careers and reputations potentially at stake. "She's behind the aircraft," observed Lieutenant Martinez, her voice carrying the diagnostic tone of an experienced aviator. "In conditions like these, you need to be ahead of the situation, anticipating what's going to happen rather than reacting to what's already occurred." The assessment was accurate, but unsympathetic. Julia's approach profile showed the characteristics of a pilot who was responding to problems rather than preventing them. Her altitude control was erratic, her airspeed management was inconsistent, and her lineup with the carrier's center line required constant correction. The performance was technically safe, but far from optimal. Morrison accessed the comparative performance database, pulling up scores from other pilots who had faced similar simulation scenarios. The data revealed a clear performance gap between Julia's current session and the results achieved by the squadron's top performers. The numbers painted a picture of a pilot who was struggling with conditions that others had handled more successfully. "This is why we can't rely on simulator scores," Morrison announced to the assembled group. "Bond's been posting acceptable numbers for months, but look what happens when we give her a real challenge. She's not ready for the conditions we're going to face when this storm hits." The pronouncement carried the weight of professional judgment, but it also revealed the politics that existed within the squadron. Julia's consistent but unremarkable performance had made her a convenient target for criticism, and the extreme simulation scenario was being used to justify predetermined conclusions about her capabilities. The simulation continued as Julia fought to bring her aircraft through the final phases of the approach. The carrier deck appeared to lurch beneath her simulated aircraft, moving through motions that would have been impossible to predict or compensate for in advance. The landing area seemed to shift position with each second, creating targeting challenges that pushed beyond normal human reaction times. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward to examine the simulation parameters more closely. Her experience as an instructor pilot gave her insight into the relationship between training scenarios and actual flight conditions. "These parameters are beyond what we normally use for training," she observed. "We're asking her to perform in conditions that would challenge pilots with twice her experience." The comment introduced a note of balance to the discussion, but it was largely ignored by the pilots who had already formed their opinions about Julia's capabilities. The simulation had become less about training and more about proving a point, with Julia's performance serving as evidence for predetermined conclusions about her readiness for challenging operations. As the approach continued, Julia's aircraft entered the final phase of the carrier landing sequence. The simulated deck filled her forward view, pitching and rolling through angles that made precise targeting nearly impossible. The optical landing system provided guidance, but the extreme motion of the ship meant that the visual references were constantly changing. Her aircraft seemed to be approaching a moving target that refused to remain stationary long enough for accurate aim. The simulation reached its climax as Julia's aircraft crossed the ramp of the carrier. The simulated tailhook extended for the arrestment that would determine the success or failure of her approach. The deck appeared to rush toward her aircraft, its motion exaggerated by the storm conditions that threw spray across the landing area. The moment of truth had arrived, and the assembled pilots watched with the intensity of professionals, evaluating a peer's performance under the most challenging conditions the simulator could generate. The test would reveal whether Julia's conservative approach to training concealed greater capabilities, or whether her consistent but unremarkable performance represented the true limits of her potential as a naval aviator. The claxons wail cut through the morning air as the USS Constellation sounded general quarters, its urgent tone echoing through every compartment of the massive carrier. The ship's intercom crackled to life with the voice of the officer of the deck. All hands now secure from flight operations. All aircraft personnel report to ready rooms immediately. This is not a drill." Julia emerged from the simulator, complex to find the ship's corridors filled with sailors moving with purposeful urgency. The gentle rolling motion that had characterized the carrier's movement for the past week had intensified, becoming a more pronounced pitch and roll that required careful attention to maintain balance. The storm that had been tracked by the meteorology department was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived with a vengeance that exceeded even the most pessimistic forecasts. At the ready room buzzed with activity as pilots and crew members gathered for an emergency briefing. Commander Rebecca Hayes stood at the front of the room, her face grave as she reviewed the latest weather reports. Behind her, a large display showed the storm's current position and intensity, revealing a massive spiral of destruction that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. The eye of the storm was clearly defined, surrounded by bands of wind and rain that registered sustained speeds of 70 knots with gusts approaching 90 knots. "The situation has deteriorated faster than anticipated," Commander Hayes announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect through multiple challenging deployments. "We're now dealing with conditions that exceed our normal operational parameters. All scheduled training flights are canceled, and we're implementing emergency procedures for severe weather operations." The meteorological data painted a picture of a storm system that had intensified beyond the computer model's predictions. What had begun as a manageable low-pressure system had transformed into a major weather event that threatened not just flight operations but the safety of the entire carrier group. The storm's forward speed had increased, bringing it into the carrier's operating area 12 hours earlier than expected. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood near the back of the ready room, his earlier confidence about simulator training replaced by the sobering reality of actual weather conditions. The storm outside was generating the kind of extreme conditions that had been replicated in Julia's simulation. But now the entire ship was experiencing the real effects of nature's power. The carrier's massive bulk, which normally provided stability in rough seas, was being tested by wave heights that exceeded 30 feet and wind speeds that made deck operations extremely hazardous. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Mitchell, entered the ready room flanked by his senior staff officers. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the room fell silent as he prepared to address the assembled personnel. Mitchell's weathered face bore the expression of a seasoned naval officer who had navigated countless storms, but his eyes reflected the concern that came with facing conditions that pushed beyond normal operational limits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mitchell began, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite the increasing noise of the storm outside. "We're facing a situation that requires our highest level of professional capability. The storm system has intensified beyond our projections, and we're now dealing with conditions that will test both our equipment and our personnel to their limits." The briefing screens displayed real-time data from the ship's sensors showing wind speeds that fluctuated between 60 and 80 knots, with gusts recorded at over 90 knots. The wave height measurements indicated swells exceeding 35 feet, creating conditions that would make flight operations not just challenging, but potentially catastrophic. The carrier's flight deck, normally a stable platform for aircraft operations, was moving through 3 dimensions in patterns that defied prediction. "We've received an emergency tasking from Fleet Command," Captain Mitchell continued, his announcement causing a stir among the assembled personnel. "A maritime rescue operation is underway approximately 200 miles to our northwest. A civilian research vessel has suffered catastrophic damage and is taking on water. They have 12 souls aboard, including 2 critically injured personnel who require immediate medical evacuation." The gravity of the situation became immediately apparent. A rescue mission in current weather conditions would require flying skills that exceeded normal training parameters. The civilian vessel was operating in the heart of the storm system, where wind conditions and visibility would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The mission would involve not just reaching the vessel, but conducting a medical evacuation. In conditions that made normal helicopter operations impossible, Commander Hayes accessed the tactical display, showing the position of the research vessel relative to the carrier's current location. The ship appeared as a small blip on the screen, surrounded by the massive weather system that had disabled their engines and damaged their communications equipment. The vessel's last known position placed them in an area where wave heights were estimated at 40 feet, with wind speeds that would make any rescue attempt extraordinarily dangerous. "The Coast Guard has aircraft in the area, but their helicopters can't operate in these conditions," Captain Mitchell explained. "We have the only platform capable of reaching them, but it's going to require fixed-wing aircraft that can operate from our deck in winds that exceed our normal landing parameters." The mission requirements were sobering. Any pilot attempting the rescue would need to launch from the carrier in extreme wind conditions, navigate through the storm to reach the disabled vessel, and then return to attempt a carrier landing in profondo, winds that pushed far beyond normal safety margins. The operation would require not just exceptional flying skills, but the kind of decision-making ability that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Lieutenant Commander Patterson stood to address the captain. "Sir, what are the specific wind conditions we're looking at for recovery operations?" His question reflected the concern that every pilot in the room was feeling. Carrier landings in normal conditions required precise timing and control, but attempting to land on a pitching deck in 60-knot winds would test the limits of both human capability and aircraft performance. "Current conditions on deck are showing sustained winds of 65 knots with gusts to 85 knots, came the reply from the ship's operations officer. "The deck is pitching through angles of plus or minus 15 degrees, with roll angles reaching 20 degrees. These conditions are at the absolute edge of our operational envelope. The technical specifications painted a picture of landing conditions that would challenge the most skilled pilots. The combination of high winds, reduced visibility, and violent deck motion created a scenario where the margin for error was virtually eliminated. A successful landing would require not just technical proficiency, but the kind of instinctive flying ability that could not be taught in simulators. The room fell silent as the implications of the mission became clear. Someone would need to volunteer for an operation that pushed beyond normal safety parameters, flying in conditions that had never been encountered in training. The rescue of 12 civilian lives depended on finding a pilot willing and able to operate at the extreme limits of naval aviation capability. Julia sat quietly in the back of the room, her mind processing the technical challenges that the mission would present. The conditions described matched exactly the parameters she had just experienced in the simulator. But now the stakes were real. 12 lives hung in the balance, and the decision of who would attempt the rescue would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed. The storm continued to intensify outside, its howling winds creating a constant background noise that reminded everyone aboard of the forces they were facing. The carrier's massive bulk groaned under the stress of the heavy seas, while the flight deck above was swept by winds that made normal operations impossible. In these conditions, the difference between life and death would be measured in the skill and courage of whoever accepted the challenge of flying into the heart of the storm. The briefing continued as operational planners worked to develop a rescue profile that balanced the need for speed with the reality of the extreme conditions. Time was running out for the research vessel, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of a successful rescue. The decision of who would attempt the mission could not be delayed much longer, and the weight of that choice hung over the ready room like the storm that raged outside. The silence in the ready room stretched uncomfortably as Captain Mitchell's words hung in the air. The request for a volunteer pilot to attempt the rescue mission had created a moment of reckoning that exposed the difference between training confidence and real-world courage. Every pilot in the room understood the technical challenges involved, but understanding and accepting were entirely different propositions. Lieutenant Commander Morrison shifted in his seat, his eyes moving between the weather display and the tactical screen showing the research vessel's position. The same pilot who had been so confident in critiquing simulator performance now faced the reality of conditions that exceeded anything he had encountered in actual flight operations. His extensive experience, while valuable, had been gained in more manageable weather conditions that bore little resemblance to the current situation. "The aircraft we're looking at for this mission is a single-seat Super Hornet," announced Commander Hayes, her voice cutting through the tension. "The pilot will be operating alone, without the benefit of a weapons systems officer or navigator. The mission profile requires low-level flight through the storm system, followed by a search pattern over the disabled vessel, and then a return approach to the carrier in conditions that are at the absolute limit of our operational capabilities." The technical specifications of the mission continued to paint a daunting picture. The Super Hornet would need to maintain control in turbulence that could generate G-forces exceeding the aircraft's normal flight envelope. The pilot would be required to navigate using instruments alone, as visual references would be virtually eliminated by the storm conditions. Most challenging of all, the return to the carrier would require a landing approach in winds that exceeded the aircraft's published operational limits. Lieutenant Commander Patterson cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself as he prepared to speak. His reputation as one of the squadron's most skilled pilots had been built on successful operations in challenging conditions. But the current situation pushed beyond even his extensive experience. "Sir, I have to ask about the recovery parameters. Are we talking about a trap in 60-knot winds, or are conditions expected to moderate by the time the pilot returns?" The question struck at the heart of every pilot's concern. Carrier landings in normal conditions required precise timing and control, but attempting to catch an arrestor wire on a pitching deck in extreme winds would test the limits of both human capability and aircraft performance. The margin for error in such conditions was essentially zero, with the consequences of failure potentially catastrophic. Current projections show the storm maintaining intensity for at least the next 6 hours, replied the ship's meteorologist, Lieutenant Commander Chun. Wind conditions on deck are expected to remain in the 60 to 70 knot range throughout the mission timeframe. The pilot will need to execute the recovery in conditions that match or exceed current parameters. The meteorological briefing eliminated any hope that conditions might improve during the mission timeframe. Whoever accepted the challenge would need to complete the entire operation in storm conditions, from launch through recovery. The technical demands of the mission required not just exceptional flying skills, but the kind of mental fortitude that could maintain focus and precision under extreme stress. Julia sat quietly in the back of the room, her mind processing the mission parameters with the analytical approach that had characterized her training. The conditions described matched exactly what she had just experienced in the simulator, but with one crucial difference: the stakes were now measured in human lives rather than training scores. The extreme weather parameters, the challenging recovery conditions, and the technical demands of single-pilot operations were all elements she had practiced extensively, albeit in the artificial environment of the simulator. The room's atmosphere grew heavier as the reality of the mission became clear. Several pilots exchanged glances, each weighing their own capabilities against the extraordinary demands of the rescue operation. The confidence that had been displayed during normal operations seemed to evaporate in the face of conditions that pushed beyond the boundaries of routine naval aviation. Commander Hayes consulted her tablet, reviewing the personnel files and qualifications of the assembled pilots. The decision of who would attempt the mission required careful consideration of experience, capability, and psychological readiness. The wrong choice could result not just in mission failure, but in the loss of both the pilot and the aircraft, while still leaving the research vessel's crew in mortal danger. "I need to know who's prepared to accept this mission," Captain Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "This is not a situation where we can afford to make mistakes. The pilot who goes out there needs to be absolutely certain of their ability to complete the mission successfully." The request for volunteers created a moment of truth that revealed the gap between confidence and courage. The pilots who had been most vocal in their criticism of others' performance now faced the ultimate test of their own capabilities. The extreme conditions that had been discussed in theoretical terms were now a reality that demanded action rather than analysis. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood slowly, his movement drawing attention from across the room. His reputation and experience marked him as a logical choice for the mission, but his expression revealed the internal struggle between duty and self-preservation. "Sir, I've got over 1,500 hours of flight time, but I have to be honest about the conditions we're facing. These winds are beyond anything I've operated in before." The admission was both honest and sobering. Morrison's extensive experience, while valuable, had been gained in more manageable conditions that provided little preparation for the current situation. His acknowledgement of the mission's extreme nature highlighted the fact that normal experience might not be sufficient for the challenges ahead. Other pilots began to voice similar concerns, each acknowledging the technical demands of the mission, while expressing reservations about their readiness to operate in such extreme conditions. The conversation revealed a fundamental truth about naval aviation: that experience in normal operations did not automatically translate to capability. In extraordinary circumstances, Julia found herself standing before she had consciously made the decision to volunteer. The movement was instinctive, driven by an understanding that the mission parameters matched her recent training experience more closely than anyone else's. The extreme conditions that had been used to test her capabilities in the simulator were now the reality that needed to be faced. "I'll take the mission," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the commitment she was making. The words carried across the ready room with surprising authority, causing heads to turn and expressions to change as the assembled pilots processed her offer. The announcement created a moment of stunned silence. Julia's reputation as a competent but unremarkable pilot had not prepared anyone for her willingness to accept a mission that more experienced aviators had found daunting. Her volunteer status challenged the assumptions that had been made about her capabilities and raised questions about the relationship between training performance and actual flying ability. Commander Hayes looked up from her tablet, her expression reflecting surprise at the unexpected volunteer. "Lieutenant Bond, are you certain about this? The mission parameters exceed normal operational limits by significant margins. You'll be operating alone in conditions that would challenge pilots with twice your experience." The question was fair and necessary. Julia's training record, while satisfactory, had not suggested the kind of exceptional capability that the mission would require. Her willingness to volunteer raised legitimate concerns about whether confidence matched competence, particularly given the life-or-death nature of the operation. "Ma'am, I've been training for exactly these conditions," Julia replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "The simulator parameters I just completed match the mission requirements. I understand the risks, but I also understand what needs to be done." The reference to her simulator training drew immediate attention from the pilots who had been critiquing her performance earlier. The same training session that had been used to highlight her limitations was now being cited as preparation for a real-world mission. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room, and the dynamics of the situation began to shift as Julia's volunteer status forced a re-evaluation of previously held assumptions. The moment of truth had arrived, and Julia's willingness to accept. The mission would determine whether 12 lives were saved or lost. The decision now rested with the command structure, who would need to balance the desperate need for action against the risks of sending a pilot whose capabilities remained largely untested in real-world extreme conditions. The catapult shot launched Julia's Super Hornet into the teeth of the storm, with a violence that compressed her entire body against the ejection seat. The aircraft accelerated from 0 to 170 miles per hour in 2.5 seconds, the massive steam-powered system hurling 30 tons of metal and human determination into winds that immediately began battering the fighter from every direction. As the aircraft cleared the carrier's deck, Julia felt the full fury of the storm take hold, the Super Hornet bucking and rolling through turbulence that threatened to tear the wings from the fuselage. The cockpit became a chaos of warning lights and alarm sounds as the aircraft fought to maintain controlled flight through conditions that exceeded every design parameter. Julia's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls, her training taking over as conscious thought gave way to instinctive response. The artificial horizon spun wildly as the aircraft was caught in a massive downdraft, losing 2,000 feet of altitude in seconds before she could arrest the descent and regain control. Navigation through the storm required flying entirely on instruments, the outside world reduced to a gray-black void of rain and wind that made visual reference impossible. Julia's eyes scanned the multifunction displays, processing information from GPS, radar, and inertial navigation systems, while her hands maintained the constant control inputs necessary to keep the aircraft flying. The storm cell extended from sea level to over 40,000 feet, creating a wall of weather that challenged the very limits of what the Super Hornet could endure. The mission consumed 3 hours of flying that felt like a lifetime. Julia located the research vessel through a combination of radar contact and emergency beacon signals, finding the civilian ship wallowing in seas that dwarfed its 200-foot length. The vessel's crew had managed to launch life rafts, but the injured personnel remained aboard, unable to abandon ship due to their medical conditions. The Super Hornet sensors recorded the scene below, transmitting critical information back to the carrier's Rescue Coordination Center. Communication with the research vessel was intermittent, broken by atmospheric interference and the limitations of emergency radio equipment. Julia coordinated the rescue efforts, directing Coast Guard helicopters to the life raft positions while confirming that the injured personnel were prepared for evacuation by a Navy helicopter that would arrive once the storm's intensity decreased. Her role was not to conduct the rescue directly, but to serve as a communication relay and search coordinator, ensuring that all personnel were accounted for and that rescue assets were positioned effectively. The return flight to the carrier tested every aspect of Julia's flying ability. The storm had intensified during her 3-hour mission, with surface winds now exceeding 80 knots and wave heights reaching 45 feet. The constellation appeared on her radar as a small blip moving through the enormous weather system, its position marked by the electronic signatures of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, fighting to maintain course and speed in conditions that challenged. Even its massive displacement. As Julia approached the carrier's position, the reality of the landing challenge became immediately apparent. The ship's flight deck, normally a stable platform measuring over 1,000 feet in length, appeared to be moving through 3 dimensions simultaneously. The massive vessel pitched through angles that exceeded 20 degrees, while rolling side to side, through arcs that would have been impossible to imagine in normal sea conditions. The landing area was swept by winds that approached 90 knots, creating turbulence patterns that defied prediction or compensation. The approach began 20 miles from the carrier, with Julia configuring the Super Hornet for landing while fighting to maintain controlled flight through the storm's outer bands. The aircraft's tailhook was extended, its arresting gear ready to engage the carrier's arrestor wires in a controlled crash that would bring 30 tons of aircraft to a complete stop in less than 300 feet. The landing would require timing and precision that pushed beyond the limits of normal human capability. The carrier's flight deck crew had prepared for the recovery with extraordinary measures. Additional safety equipment was staged, while the ship's medical team stood ready to respond to any emergency. The landing signal officers took their positions despite the dangerous conditions, their expertise crucial to guiding Julia through the final phases of the approach. The deck was cleared of all non-essential personnel, leaving only those whose presence was absolutely necessary for the landing operation. Julia's approach to the carrier was a masterpiece of precision, flying under impossible conditions. The techniques she had developed during months of simulator training, the conservative approach speeds, the careful altitude management, the methodical corrections proved perfectly adapted to the extreme conditions. Her aircraft maintained a stable glide path despite turbulence that would have challenged the most experienced pilots. Her control inputs smooth and predictive rather than reactive. The landing signal officers watched in amazement as Julia's Super Hornet approached through conditions that made normal carrier operations impossible. Her aircraft appeared to be immune to the violent wind shear and downdrafts that had been forecast, maintaining the precise flight path necessary for a successful arrestment. The approach was textbook perfect, executed with a level of skill that few pilots could have achieved under such extraordinary circumstances. The Super Hornet's tailhook caught the number 3 arrestor wire with a precision that spoke to Julia's exceptional ability to time the landing despite the carrier's violent motion. The aircraft was brought to a complete stop in under 250 feet, the arresting gear system absorbing the tremendous kinetic energy of the landing with mechanical efficiency that saved both aircraft and pilot. Julia had achieved what many had considered impossible: a successful carrier landing in wind conditions that exceeded all operational limits. The immediate aftermath of the landing was subdued, the magnitude of the achievement overshadowed by the relief that the mission had been completed successfully. Julia climbed from the cockpit to find the flight deck crew working to secure her aircraft, their professionalism masking the wonder they felt at having witnessed such extraordinary flying. The storm continued to rage around the carrier, but the rescue mission had been accomplished, and 12 lives had been saved. In the days that followed, the story of Julia's flight spread throughout the carrier and beyond. The same pilots who had criticized her simulator performance found themselves struggling to comprehend how she had succeeded where others feared to attempt. The techniques that had been dismissed as overly conservative proved to be perfectly adapted to extreme conditions, while her methodical approach to training had prepared her for challenges that more aggressive pilots could not have handled. Rescue operation became a case study in naval aviation, demonstrating that exceptional performance could come from unexpected sources. Julia's story challenged assumptions about pilot capability and the relationship between training scores and real-world performance. Her success was not the result of natural talent or aggressive flying, but of careful preparation, methodical training, and the courage to accept a mission that others found too daunting. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind calm seas and clear skies that seemed almost anticlimactic after the drama of the rescue mission. The research vessel's crew was safely recovered, their gratitude extending to the Navy personnel who had risked their lives to save them. The incident was recorded in the ship's log as a successful humanitarian mission, but for those who witnessed Julia's performance, it represented something far more significant: proof that true capability often lies hidden beneath the surface of ordinary appearance. Julia returned to her regular duties aboard the Constellation, her reputation forever changed by the events of that stormy day. The same pilots who had once overlooked her now sought her advice on advanced flying techniques, while her simulator training methods became the subject of serious study. She had proven that expertise could be developed through patience and persistence, and that the most valuable pilots were often those who prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. The story of Julia Bond's impossible landing became part of naval aviation lore, a reminder that courage and skill can emerge from the most unlikely sources. Her achievement stood as testament to the power of thorough preparation, the value of methodical training, and the truth that real strength often reveals itself only when tested by the most extreme circumstances. In the end, the pilot who had been laughed at for her simulator scores had saved 12 lives and proven that true capability cannot be measured by conventional metrics alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload.